Good morning. Ayon Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1242. Aleph Resh Mem Beis. Learning about two levels in Bina, which he calls Bina's in Shem Sag, the name of Yud Kei Vav Kei in the configuration of 63, and Sag is two levels in Sag, as Sus, the horse, Sus, horse, in Ruchnius is twice Sag. Sus is 126, which is twice 63, and the two levels are referring to Mamata Lamaila, Mamayla Lamata. Mamayla Lamata, meaning from the top down, is when Bina, in the name Sag, descends and spreads out and hovers over the Afrechim, her offspring, her chicks, in the means of Seichel, as it gives birth and protects the Midas, because without that protection, the Midas on their own can be a Yenika and Anachiz, as he said, that negative forces can grasp it and distract and draw energy from it. And that's why you need to have the seichel, the tfuna, which he calls in Bina itself, tfuna, that relates to these midas and keeps them aligned. And that's what causes the refinement of the emotions, bir midas, like we learn about Sfiras Ha'emer, that when you makifim the ima, the makifim of Bina, of the mother, that causes the refinement. But in that case, Bina is not in its natural core place. It's Bina, it's a yurida me'etzem atzmus, as he puts it. It's a descent of Bina into a lower level of the emotions. And in order to guide them and direct them and protect them. Achamadega Habeis, we learned the second level in Shem Sag is Remus Visnas is go, where you're talking about Bina rising up from the bottom up, going back to its source, so to speak, where Bina is Bebchinas Ha'atzmi Shalah, using the language from the Maimer. Bina is now in its core place. So it's just like when you talk about a mother taking care of children, she's not in her place as her full stature. That's not, doesn't mean that being a mother is a negative, is a lower level. It just means that her whole very being is now involved in a lower, like a teacher who's guiding the students, not the teacher on his own level. So now it's an atzmi shelamaylam b'chinas hamidus legami. That's completely higher than the midas. The parentheses we learned, we spoke that Bina, as its ema bonim, that's a kol b'chinas chetzeni is Bina. He identified it as being the outer dimension of Bina, as it's the moker lemidus. And he explained that's because that's Bina as a comprehension. Bina in the state of comprehension, that it comprehends something, even pnimius asar, even an inner dimension of comprehension, is still, compared to what Bina is on its purest form, core level, is still called chetzenius. With Bina being the moker hakartiv, and Chochma being the moker harochik. And that's where you see distinction. Aval etzem b'chinas habina, he kamoy b'chinas hachochma, she'ein b'chinas moker limidas klal. The etzem of Bina, meaning habina, when it relates to the very truth of the idea, and it gets absorbed in that, it's like Chochma. Because Bina is moichin. Moichin and midas are two separate domains and two different entities that are fundamentally different. So therefore, moichin be'etzem, there's moichin that relates, even though they're different, there's moichin, there's intelligence that relates to emotions, but fundamentally, moichin is ma'alam ha'midas. As he explained this is the parentheses, and he brings from Imre Bina, that there's a level of a yichud that is completely not shaykhs to the midas. It's a yichud of Chochma and Bina, which of course brings us back to the Zivuk Shalom, the complete union where Chochma and Bina are the same stature, and what dominates there is the resonating truths of Chochma that also affect Bina. I just wanted to see one language, one expression that wanted to just look at. Just give me a second. When he says Zivuk Shalom, yeah. On page 1236, he says Zivuk Shalom, Kisha'aba v'im shavim b'keimosam, they're equal in stature. V'gam hamshacha nimshach b'chachma, the Abba shuyin atzilish b'chachma. Yeah, what dominates there, radiates, is the Yichud Chachma. Okay. And then, after the parenthesis, he went back to Shlach Tishlach Esa'im, the mitzvah of sending away the mother. I explained that in Aveda. What is that? So he said that through the Midas, which is the Afrechim are the chicks, through the Midas, the offspring, causes an aliyah, nasa aliyah b'chinas bina, that it goes to atzmi shalah. So explaining shlach tishlach hasa'im as being the mother returning back to her core being, not as she is protecting her offspring, her midas. V'hainu, and he said, after the stage where she hovers over and protects her chicks, her emotions. So Zeb Chinas Tfuna, which he says was Chitzeni is Bina Ben Bas, which is the Mokal Midas. Achakach comes the Shlach Tishlach Esa'im, that through the Midas, which is the Sus Momata Lamaila, is now climbing and going back up. Nasa Aliyas Abina B'chinas Remus. Bina then comes in the state of Remumus. Now you may remember, Remumus is the operative word in the big part of Ayon Beis. Remumus is going toward Keser. Remumus is going toward an exalted state that's not manifesting and relating to existence. It's the other way around. Bina facing Chochma, and Chochma and Bina together facing Arich, which receives some Atik, as we learned. And the parentheses, the final parentheses we learned yesterday, then Zah becomes the level of Ish Tfunis. So he says, how does he explain Ish Tfunis? The Emek HaMelech, Ish Tfunis Yadleno, the Zah Maila B'chinas Tfuna. So he said, Taish Yadleno, which means can mean to flow, but here he's tightening from the Dulu Einem Et Lamorim, to raise the eyes to heaven, from the word Aliyah. So it's the elevation of Bina Tfuna gets elevated through the Midas. I didn't have a chance to look it up yet, but that's what he says. So now he's going to explain Ayin Hu. So we're going to continue learning from the 7 lines of the bottom of page 1242. The pages can be found at ayonbeis.com. So he says now Ayin Hu. The Inyan in this is the Hine Ovis Heina Merkava. The Ovis, the Medrash says they are the Merkava. They're a chariot, which means their entire being is nothing more than a vehicle to carry and express the divine godliness. For who? Sha'ovis Hem B'chinas Chagas. What the meaning of this is, the Ovis are Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov is Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, and that respectively, in that order. V'hem b'chinas Merkava l'Chochma Bina. So they're the midas of Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, and they're a Merkava, a chariot, like a wagon, a chariot, to the level of Chochma and Bina. So the midas carry Chochma and Bina, and they yes. Ukamoy. Shamarkova Magbia es Arechiv Lamaila, and just as a chariot elevates and lifts up the one who's riding on the chariot upward. Now, this could mean two things. This could mean literally that you're on a chariot. The chariot is carrying you as the chariot goes up, climbs up a mountain, let's say. So the chariot is carrying you. So that's the most likely meaning of what he's saying here. But you could also say that when you climb up on a chariot, you're also going up. I don't think he means that. I think he means that it's magbiya. Kamoy kain hamidus magbiya mesamechin. So the same as midas carry the moichin. He doesn't explain yet what this means. So let's be patient a moment. I'm going to explain it. I first want to see what the Rebbe Rashab is going to say, and then we'll see what we need to explain. So just like a chariot elevates and lifts up the one who's riding, so here the rider is moichin and the chariot is midas. So midas carry and lift up as hameichin. Okay. I'm going to explain it. I'll explain it. Even though we've been learning till now, obviously, that moichin, intellect, is superior to emotions in the sense that emotions are more subjective and they more relate to the human being's natural wiring. And it's moichin that can elevate and refine the midas to the point that we learned even that the moichin can elevate the midas to even change them and create a new flow that transcends and is greater than the natural structure of the midas. So children, as we're born with a certain emotional infrastructure. As we grow and mature, that develops. Moichin, the mind helps, the maturity of the mind helps to mature the emotions. And then they come to higher levels. But now he's going and turning the other way around. There's something the emotions do for the moichin in elevating them. So let's explain what that means. The most basic level, the way Chassidus explains it, is this. A person who's living in their head, they can be brilliant, but if they're unable to express it in emotional intelligence, there's something missing. It's like a person who's a book smart. So their minds are very powerful, but there's a certain detachment from reality. Midas ground the intelligence and bring it into a form of experience. So you could say, for example, I know God is great. Okay. And therefore it's worthy of me loving God or being drawn to God. Like we learned from Perek Tezayin and Tanya. But that's not an emotional experience. That is the mind saying it's a good thing. Emotions, when you actually stimulate and the feelings are there that are driven by the mind, because the mind contemplated and understood the idea, so it awakened and stimulated, gave birth to the emotions, but then the emotions give something back to the mind that the mind doesn't have on its own. And that is the experience of it. It would be like someone saying, I know everything in life, but never find love. You even know things that are worthy of loving, but you never experience love in your life. So on one hand, the midas bring the moichin down because now you're going from an abstract, pure idea into a life experience. But on the other hand, that creates the experience, elevates, and completely transforms the individual. So to use the expression with a mother, even though in this world, some people look down at the idea of someone being a mother, because a person to be established should have a career, should use all their skills. When they're busy mothering, the children dominate. And the mother has to go down to the level of the children, as we've been learning here. But there's something that happens when a person takes care of their children, just like any love, that makes you a greater person, as smart as you may be, a woman may be, or for that matter, a man, a genius. And their atzmius, they're higher level than we're dealing with their children. But we all know what children do for parents. It turns you into a very different type of human being. To use an example of a teacher and a student, so even though the teacher is far superior mind than the students, and you could even argue that the teacher, where is he going to thrive most? He'd be with his own colleagues, or with his teacher, or with his colleagues. And yet the Gemara says that Harbe Lamadati, I learned much from my teachers. I learned more from my colleagues. But B'talmidai, Yesem Kulam. From my students, I learned most. So you could ask the question, why? With students, you had to go through a tzimtzum. You had to conceal your brilliance. You're not talking to equals. You're talking to students, especially beginner students. So why do you learn most from your students? Because it's not the power of intelligence. The students bring out a deeper intelligence, not just brain power, I should have said. They bring out through their questions. They sharpen you. And also the mere fact that you have to bring down the subject matter to a level that's not your own, or not a level of your colleagues or your teachers, that alone causes you to have to understand the idea much better. So this is the paradox. On one hand, Moichin is higher than Midas. On the other hand, Midas make it come alive and the experience becomes far richer. This is one explanation of why we say the Midas lift up the Moichin. And it is to complete the picture. Till now, we've been talking how Moichin guides the Midas, because a child's Midas emotions are limited, are subjective, are very immature, and the mind needs to mature them. But then there's something that the Midas do for the Moichin, is what he's saying right now. So in Bina, is Bina as it relates to the Midas protecting them. And then what happens next is that the Midas elevate Bina and give it, it reaches a higher dimension to be able to go back to its source and to the Atzmis of Bina, as he's explaining here. So what is that? How does that express itself in the Oves? So the Oves, even though the Avram Yitzchak Yankov had Moichin, but they're primarily the focus on Chagas, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak Gvura, Yaakov Teferes, compassion, Rachamim, and that serves as a merkava to the Chochma and Bina of Elikus by elevating it, just like a chariot elevates and helps the person who's riding the chariot get to higher places and greater places. That's what a chariot's role is to lift up and to elevate us to the place we want to reach. So the Midas in turn here are doing that for Chochma and Bina. But before I take any questions, I just want to read a little more here, because I see well, you know what? Let me stop for a moment. There's going to be more on this topic. So if you have questions more on the topic itself, we should probably read further. But if something is unclear in what I've said, and maybe take this opportunity to pause if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay. And now he says, so where's the power come? How do Midas, which were born, how could children elevate their mother when the mother gave birth to them? So here's the interesting twist here. So now he introduces a new concept. I mean, new relative to what we've been learning till now, which we haven't learned. We've learned it earlier in Ayin Beis, but not in this whole section. He says, V'hu, and this reason for this is mipnei shesherish hamidus u'lamayla m'sherish hameich. The root of emotions, of midas, is higher than the root of intelligence. Now I know the immediate thing we jump on, one second. We've been speaking here at length how midas, mutva, murgish, muskul, that mutva is far lower than seichel. And yet he's saying here that the root of emotions is higher than the root of seichel, moichin, of intelligence. So we understand that's, of course, an obvious question, but let's see how he explains it. The Abba ve'ima in the language of Kabbalah, this is Abba ve'ima, which is meichin, but mazla is kalilu. So this is an expression by belief from Zohar, that Chochma and Bina, but mazla is kalilu. They're encompassed, they're rooted in the mazel of Arich. Mazel is usually the level of a source. So Abba ve'ima comes from mazel of this kalilu. The Zoh ba'atika ochid v'talia. And Zoh, though it comes down lower than moichin in its actual manifestation, but it's ochid detali means it's united and dependent on, connected with atik. So mazel is a level which is usually connected to Arich Ampin. So the mazel is kalilu, and Zoh goes all the way up to atika ochid detali. That's the language, that's the Kabbalistic terms. So what we're going to learn, and let me just say briefly, this is not uncommon. You hear this very often, that when it comes in manifestation, one thing is lower than another. When you go to the root, the lower one is rooted in a higher level than the higher one. So in Giluyim, in the power of revelation and Gilui, obviously Moichin is more intense and more powerful than Midas. But if you're talking about in the Etzem, in the very core power of our own emotion, it's rooted in a deeper level. Like we say sometimes, the Sheirish HaKelim, even though the Kelim, the containers, are lower than the energies, the Oyer, and they actually emerge from the Oyer, but the root of the containers comes from a place that's deeper than the root of the Oyer. But I don't want to elaborate more yet. I want to first see how he's going to explain it, then we'll discuss it. Ukamoi, like it is, Sha'aseichel, Huma maskil, Shime Yesi Lamaila Maseichel. Seichel, intelligence, is rooted from the koyach hamaskil, from the power of intelligence. Just like there's the koyach hariyah, the power to see, from which is rooted vision. There's a koyach hariyah in the nefesh. So there's a maskil. The seichel is coming from the maskil. Maskil means the one that's conceiving. Shime Yesi Lamaila Maseichel. Even though the maskil is higher than the seichel, the kol mokim hare, what do they say? Einoi. Here it says Eina legamri. Here they say below, it should say Eina musla legamri. Even though it's higher, Eina musla legamri, because Eina legamri would be contradict what he wants to say. It's not totally negated from and completely beyond seichel. Eina musla legamri ina seichel. It's the source of seichel. So let's go back to what maskil means. Maskil is sometimes defined as like the collective unconscious, some people call it, but I would rather say, think of it like the reservoir, the superconscious reservoir, sometimes associated with Chochma and Bina, actually, where all ideas come from. So it's the power to conceive ideas. A seichel itself is the idea that it conceives. So seichel would be the conscious intelligence that we are conscious of. Where is it coming from? It comes from the maskil. So the maskil is definitely higher than the seichel. And it's a different dimension. We can't even access it directly. We only access it as it flows into consciousness. But there's still a commonality between maskil and seichel. We learned about this at length in volume 2, where he spoke, or even volume 1 even. We were speaking about when you say that lower level connects to a higher level. So seichel and maskil, on one hand, the maskil is definitely a higher state, but it also ultimately you cannot say that it's completely have no connection to them. Maskil relates to seichel. Maskil does not create, for example, midas. Maskil doesn't create other things. Maskil creates intelligence. That means there is a commonality between them. Now, I question a little whether you should say mushlo, because if I recall correctly in volume 1, when he spoke about this, he says, maskil is, well, the truth is, there's an expression in that sometimes you say the maskil is not at all seichel. It's only the source of seichel. But here you have to say that he's saying, because he says Makol Mokim, so that means he's saying that even though it's l'mayla ma'seichel, you have to say it still connects to seichel. Ubechlolos, and in general, harihu mekeches hanefesh v'loy etzem hanefesh. And in general, this is from the koyach hanefesh, koyach hamaskil. Just like you have the koyach of I said koyach hariyah or koyach hashmiyah, the power to see, the power to hear. You have the power. It's not etzem hanefesh. It's not the core soul. The core soul transcends intelligence. Aval hamides, but by contrast, the emotions, hein me'etzem nefesh. They come from atika ochid v'talya, means they come from that core soul. The b'shorshim hein ha'ashrasha pshuta shebenefesh. Because in their root, they're the hashrasha pshuta. They are the seamless, or the, you can say, the shapeless. The shapeless, they're like, the word is ingrained, or engraved, not engraved, but like seated with the word D. Like when you seed something, it's seated in the very core of the soul. Like he says in the mind Ba'alescha Beis, which is Amid Tov Kuf Ches Ve'elach. Let me see that. I want to just see inside for a moment to refresh my memory. Tov Kuf Ches. Yeah. I'll explain in a moment what this means. Okay. Yeah, I thought so. So this is a very good explanation. If you want to see it, it's on page 2, the first volume of Ayon Beis, page 908. I'm sorry, 508. Tov Kuf, 508, 507 and on, 508, yeah. So let me tell you what he says there, which is a very vital component here. When you talk about, again, firepower, Seichel has the most power, has a very strong firepower because of its intense brain power, the Seichel. But Seichel can change. An individual's mind and ideas can change from one idea to another. Your personality never changes. I know you could say, 1 second, didn't we learn that Seichel can change midas? We're going to learn about that later. But right now, there's the element that when you are born with a certain genetic makeup, we're not talking about acquired emotions. We're not talking about acquired personality that you learn from people. We're talking about the things that actually define your very DNA and your genes. So the emotions are referring to now, not purely emotions, whether you love something, you don't love something. Your emotional, your makeup that you're born with, he says, is rooted in the Etzem HaNefesh, because that's how the Etzem HaNefesh is shaped. It's shaped a certain way. Seichel, on the other hand, can go through changes. Now, you could say, 1 second, don't people are also born with a certain genetic way of thinking? In other words, the way their mind works, the way they... So he talks about that back there in that volume. Then volume 1, basically it's chapter 251, if you want the chapters. But ultimately, Seichel, yes, Seichel does have some elements of inclination, like we say, Shammai is Gvura, and Hillel is Chesed, but you see right away, you say Chesed and Gvura, which means that's their emotional makeup, and that in turn defines how their minds work. So we're not talking about the mind as an active conscious presence. The active consciousness of intelligence can change. If someone could tell you something, and you could change your mind completely. But nobody can change your very personality, the very definition of what defines you as a person. So he's defining midas now in that sense, not the midas that are born from Seichel, but the midas as our part of the ingrained DNA that are seated within our very, very essence. And that, he says, is the midas, and that's rooted deeper than Seichel. Now, I know, as I said, we still need to understand how that Stims, how do you reconcile that with what we've been learning about midas? But the fact is, when we say mutva, that a person is born with a certain nature, it's true. You want to tame those emotions. You want to refine them, and you ultimately want to transcend and elevate them. But that doesn't take away from the fact that that's how the person is actually shaped. So we have to still understand, what about the stage when you start changing your midas, like he said, that Chochma is able to change and bring a Arich Chadash, as we shall probably learn. I'm just speculating here, that the Arich Chadash doesn't mean you change your personality. It means you're able to transcend your personality, and that very personality goes back to its root, how it is in godliness. But it's not like trying to change a person who's a person of chesed into a person of gvura. Those are fundamental things, but there's an element of transcending. But I don't want to jump and come to anything conclusive, because we have not learned that yet. But just to keep the flow here, so he's saying now that midas therefore are rooted in etzem nefesh, what he calls hashrasha pshuta shebenefesh, and I'm on top of page 1243 now. Well, lechein, and because they're rooted in the very core of who we are, heim nase b'chinas merkava lechochma and bina. They become a merkava, a chariot for Chochma and Bina, for intelligence. That when the midas, in this case the chariot, is climbing like with a horse, that's carrying the chariot upward, due to their root and source, ha'atzmi, their core root and source. They also elevate that the meichin that are riding in that chariot, the meichin. Like he says in Torah Er, Parsha Yisrael, on which Maimer Azal, I assume he means b'mazli iskalilu v'zo ba'tika achudetalia, because there's no other Maimer Azal in unless he means the Maimer Azal of a Seina Merkut. I'd have to look that up. Which Maimer Azal he means? Does he mean Ovis in a Merkava, or does he mean Zo Batika Achudetalia? Okay, I'll look it up and I'll let you know. V'hainu, what this means is the Ava, Abba ve'ima b'mazli is kalilu, that now Abba ve'ima Chochma and Bina b'mazli is kalilu, they're encompassed in mazel, in the mazel. He's bringing it back to what we learned before. This is how Chochma and Bina are receiving their energy from the Cyrus, the hair of Arich. Mazel v'netzer v'nake. That's the Mazel 8 and 13 that he spoke about on the page 1239. Remember, he spoke about the face, the cheeks, the forehead, and then the hair. So the hair he spoke about was a lower level, which is where which comes through the channels or the thin wires of the hair. I'm just looking back what he said back there. Yeah, that it comes from the ponim, because it's not zivuk shalom. So he says, it only comes from the ponim of Arich. He said the Eitz Chaim, that means the Cyrus. Okay, so that's the lower level where Bina is connecting more with the emotions as it comes down. Now we're talking about, so that's Abba ve'ima b'mazlo, by the aliyas hamidus, and through the elevation of the midas. Now I'm coming to think that he's talking elevation of the midas. Till now, we were saying, well, yeah, the midas are now elevated, they've been matured. Misalim b'chinas Chochma Bina shemekablim b'chinas ha'oris ponim, the Arich b'chinas trein tapuchim. So now, when the midas become more mature, what happens is Misalim b'chinas Chochma and Bina get elevated, and now they're receiving not through the hair, but through the reflection of the face of Arich from the trein tapuchin, like the cheeks, where there's no hair. The gam l'maylam is b'chinas mitzcha, the Arich. and also higher than this as they receive from the metzach, the forehead of Arich. U'kamoshn is bar leil, as was explained earlier. So let me read a few more lines, and then I'm going to stop for discussion. V'zeu shlach tishlach es ha'em, and this is the meaning of sending away the mother. Shamidus esim aliyah v'agba b'bchinas bina. That the midas are causing an elevation and a lifting of the level of bina, the mother, lifting an elevation of the mother of bina. Okay. The reason I'm pausing here, I'm just looking here. Now he's going to say the midas is nichlolin b'chinas bina. Just a moment. Okay.
Because the sheresh hamidus is higher.
Yeah. 1 second, just a second. Okay, yeah, this is going to be very interesting what he's going to say. But let me pause now. Again, it's not finished. The next section, he's going to discuss the difference between the midas as they are initially in their immature state, still from the very DNA and very genetic makeup, and how the midas get refined and mature, and in turn, they will elevate the moichin. So in other words, the moichin that refine and mature the midas then join the moichin together and all of them get elevated. That's what he's going to say here. So he's basically adding this point. We're going to learn it inside shortly, today or tomorrow, that the midas, when they get refined and elevated, you don't leave them behind. They're still the very core of the Etzem HaNefesh. But now you have the best of the midas. Once you matured them and you eliminated, so to speak, their excesses and their subjectivity, now you're going to be benefiting that the moichin itself is going to be elevated through the midas to the highest levels. So that ultimately what we're going to have here is one beautiful family. It's not just that the mother goes back to Chochma, to the father, and they connect to the metzach, all the higher levels of Arich, but the midas are part of the process as well. Because the midas are going to be revealing the Etzem HaNefesh that Chochma and Bina on its own does not have, at least not on the level as the midas can. That's what he's going to be saying. But before we go there, I just want to stop here because I read a while and wanted to see if anybody wants any clarity. But remember, the subject needs more. We're going to learn more about it. He's going to literally address what I was talking about before. So what's going on? The midas, are they on a lower level like a child, or are they on a higher level and they elevate everything to a higher level? So which one is it? Till now we were talking mutva, murgish, muskul, bina, chachma, all the way up to Arich and Atik. But now he's bringing the midas into the picture back again. So the midas are going to be in a refined level. Okay. Any questions?
Needs explanation, because how is the midas doing it? It's stuck higher. How is this affecting but the bina?
Okay, so this we need to read further, as I just said. So that, let's wait till I read it, then I'll explain it. But any questions of what we said till now? Okay. Yeah, we're going to have to read till the end of this paragraph on page 1243 to really get this. So let's be patient. I'll read a little more. We have some more time. So let me read. So he says like that. Okay, so shlach tishlach l'se'im shamides esim aliyah v'agba b'chinas bina. Okay. Omnom, now, qualification. Omnom aliyah zu zeis. However, this elevation, the midas of the midas, hu shamidas knichlolim b'chinas bina. Vayidei aliyah sabina. That the midas become encompassed within bina. They don't remain below. Like a merkava, you could say the merkava lifts up the rider and carries him to higher places. He's saying now there's something more. The midas become encompassed within Bina, and through that comes Aliyah Sabina. Now, we have to understand what that means exactly. But if you recall, before I read on, he said this earlier. If you remember when he spoke about, and let's put it in very simple, balabatish, simple terms. You have a child who is a newborn child, follows their impulses. The child will cry when it's hungry or tired or in pain. The child will have all its emotional reactions. As the child grows, as the baby grows, and its intelligence begins to manifest to some extent, the baby begins to speak. It can then, the seichel, it recognizes things, the child recognizes, so its emotions are still dominant, but the emotions are not completely purely reflexive. It's not just pure behavioral. It's starting to be informed a little by its intelligence. We learned this at length. And then as the child grows, let's take from a newborn, we go now to 7-year-old, 10-year-old. I'm just dropping the numbers. I mean, even though he said ages, there's the age where you can trust a child's yes and no. Pu'utes, mekach is considered mekach, considered business. But you can't still trust the child's judgment. So there's levels of maturity. In the levels of maturity, what's happening is the emotions are not disappearing. They're being guided. We learned this explicitly. He said, even when you go from mutva to murgish, from the purely reflexive, behavioral, natural emotions to emotions that are a little more guided and informed by intelligence, it's not new emotions. It's the same emotional characteristics, but now they're being guided. They're a little more mature. So as these emotions get more refined, we learned, they become more sublime. Their interests are higher interests, like we learned. Not just in comments, that instead of playing with toys, you want something of more substance. The emotions themselves are not as raw and untamed and undisciplined. They're directed and guided. He talked about the refinement of the emotions, till the point that when a person has really reached a maturity level of seichel, whether it's godless ima or godless abba, I'm not going to go through all the levels. I mean, maybe I will, briefly. The mind becomes such a controlling factor that the emotions now are completely guided by the mind, and they become what he called midas sichlim. That the midas are now less defined by their impulses and their reflexes, but more defined by the mind that's guiding them. But even then, he didn't say the human being changes. The emotions are gone. They're just more refined. Then there was a point in Chochma where he talked about, because Chochma is outside of the structure, and Chochma is Ayin, it has the ability to actually change emotions, transcend them and transform them. That's what we've learned. And there, the midas are not murgashim. He said it very clear that the midas there, you don't feel them. That's why I used the example that we get absorbed. So your emotions also get absorbed. So you're standing in front of a wonder, or you're absorbed in something you're learning. In greatness of God, all of you, the mind and the emotions are absorbed in something greater. So the emotions aren't just following their natural reflexes, but they're still there, and they're absorbed in something greater than they would be on their natural sense. That's what we've learned. What he's adding now is that the emotions, because they're rooted in the very core of who you are, even at birth. So now the mind has done its job in refining them and in elevating them, and even bringing them to a place that they themselves would never have reached, because the emotions are, at the end of the day, subjective in a certain way. But now there's the return, that the emotions do something. Now that they've become encompassed in the mind, and a human being is experiencing godliness, not just intellectually, but also emotionally. And it's a very high level of experience, because the emotions are now refined emotions and a very high level. He's saying as they get elevated, as they get encompassed in Bina, they're actually elevating together everything, because now what you're getting in return is that the very core of the human being is involved. When the seichel is, say, moyach shalat ala lev, when intelligence is controlling your emotions, so there it's guiding it, and the emotions need to be guided. We know that. but you don't have etzem hanefesh yet in place. When you can guide the emotions, they become so mature. Now the emotions have lost, so to speak. You've gotten rid of their immature part, and they're completely elevated in seichel. So now the emotions reveal something of the very core of the human being that even seichel doesn't have. But it does so together with bina, not just standing below. The midas have been elevated into moichin. It's absorbed by godliness, but now the very core who you are is part of it. So that very child that was born, where the emotions were very immature, as we're going to learn soon, there you have the natural human being, but they're not mature. Moichin creates maturity, but it's not the essence of who you are. So basically, moichin is like the guide, the captain of the ship, but the ship now is elevated in a place where the very essence of who you are becomes connected with the highest levels of godliness. So in the interface, you have it beautiful, because someone could argue, okay, you know what you did? You trained the emotions, you transcended them, you refined them, but the very human being that began the process is not part of it anymore. Seichel has brought you to another place. It would be like almost someone saying, like we learned before about Ratz, you could say, yes, you've become a very high level person, but is it you? Is it really integrated and the interface in who you are? You could argue no. So he's saying now that's not the case. When the midas become refined, they actually the very you is now the real you, the one that's refined by the seichel, and it's the real you as you connect with God. So you have both qualities. The very essence of the person's emotional infrastructure is there. At the same time, it's elevated in a very high sublime level. So the essence of the person has actually, the midas has actually become part of the seichel. The seichel has become part of the midas, and together they experience something that is completely beyond. That's my understanding of what he's saying and going to say. So really is a very high level of a very high level of transformation. What's not beautiful. Totally. One second. What? I'm sorry?
It's beautiful. Amazing, yeah. The way that you're explaining it.
Yeah. The only thing that I still want to see it and probably learn about it is where the change of the midas comes. We talked about that, a person. But I think what he wants to say, it's almost like, you know, I'm going to give one more example, and then if you want to ask anything. The Rambam brings the din in Sof Hilchos Gerushin. He says like this, that when a person, the Bezdin Torah tells a person they have to give a get, and they don't want to. So it says, you force him till he says, I want to. But here's a problem. A get mu'usa, a forced get, divorce, is not considered a get. It has to be baratz natev. You can't compel someone to give a get. If it's compelled, the get is not valid. So the Rambam answers, the truth is, he wants to give, because every Jew wants to do what God says and what the Torah says, and avoid doesn't want to do something that defies God's will. So Yitzrei hu she'anseh, his Yetzer Hara is the one that forced him, not we're forcing him. So when you compel him to give the get, you're basically eliminating the Yetzer Hara's kidnapping him. So what he really wants is, this is a din. It's a very Chassidus din in a way. The Rebbe brings it very often. Chassidus brings it. Because you suddenly see the guy is saying, I don't want. And until they actually force him, and then he says, I want. But we know he just said, I don't want. But we go back to his etzem hanefesh, his etzem wants. So here's the word. We come into this world. Your neshama is a chelik alakam emal mamish, as he explains in Tanya. The neshama, I'm talking about the nefesh alikis, wants only to do what God wants. Nishta vil, nishta ken zayin abgerissa von elikus. The divine soul, not it wants and not it could be torn away from godliness. That's. However, the Eibishter takes the neshama, puts it into a body, a guf, and a nefesh abamis, an animal soul. The animal soul has a very different interest. It wants survival. It wants to take care of itself, like an animal. It follows, what does the Alter Rebbe say in Tanya? It follows its midas. The mishkan nefesh abamis, where does the nefesh abamis reside? in the chol small in the left side of the heart, which is the place of the midas, impulses. Midas, keep that in mind. Where does the nefesh alikis reside? In the moichin, in the moyach, in the seichel, the reflective mind. And now you have a battle. The emotions say, I want to eat. I'm tempted by this, I'm tempted by that. I need to take care of myself. Aniva avsiet, me. The nefesh alikis is the reflective mind says, no, that's not the real you. The real you is to be connected to godliness. And they battle. That's the whole beginning, the whole Tanya is based on that. When moyach shalit ala lev is the first step, where the mind controls the emotions. That's what maturity is about. And you control that, you don't allow the emotions to control you. You guide them, you harness them. But then comes the second part in Tanya, after Perek Yud Ches and on, chapter 18 and on, and says there's another thing. There's an ava mesoteres. It's not just the mind can control your emotional impulses. You actually have fundamentally, you're connected to God all the time. Perek Yud Ches Yud Tes, he talks about the neshama is like a flame, and the ava, every Jew has ava, you just don't see it until there's a moment of challenge. Kal shebekalim, if they're challenged, you suddenly see it. So you have two things at work here. On one hand, the moyach, his role is to make sure that you control yourself, self-control, and growing and maturing. But it doesn't stop there. That helps you ultimately access the real nature of your emotions, which are divine emotions. So you need the seichel to educate you. You can't just say, a child is born, since as a chelik elikam and mal mamish, we don't need any education. We don't need discipline. You don't need any hadracha, no direction. No, we don't say that. Well, and say, we'll rely that the etzem and neshama is going to come out, because we have to contend with a very difficult, hostile world, an animal soul. So you need the training and the maturation of the midas, that they should know you don't do anything you like. You don't take away something that doesn't belong to you. You say thank you. You make a bracha. The whole discipline of chinuch that we learned about, you educate a child. But the goal is that ultimately you want that very essence of the child's real nature to be revealed. You don't want to eliminate that nature. You want to first educate it and then reveal and say the real nature of the person, the real natural makeup is really this aspiration, this connection to godliness. So that's another way of explaining it. I have my doubts, just for the record, whether it's exactly what he's saying here, but it definitely helps understand these two steps in the process. Okay. I'm going to stop here by Ayon Beis on page 1243. But if anybody wants to ask anything, because he's going to now explain, I believe, these two stages of how you move from the natural midas in the immature level to the natural midas as they elevate even the moichin, because they're the etzem hanefesh. But it's really, wow, that's really interesting how this happens. Okay, anybody want to ask anything? Any questions, any comments?
Simon Yeshachayach, I found it so powerful, not only fascinating. The first thing, and now the addition that you said about after Perek Yud Ches, it's amazing, just amazing, and that makes such clarity in the idea of what he's saying here, that the midas are part of the Bina and they are elevating the Bina.
My question is the first part about what Rabbi Teichel just said, that, and that's the last pasuk we read, that the midas are included in Bina. I understand how they can help elevate Bina, sort of the bottom lifting the top up, if you will, or the merkava is going higher. So necessarily the rochev is, the rider is higher because the merkava is higher. I get that, but I don't understand how something that's fundamentally emotional can become included in something that is fundamentally intellectual.
Well, that we learned earlier. He learned that at length earlier, that when, it's very straightforward. And a young child is controlled by the reflexive impulses of emotions. Let's say you start now learning the value of something spiritual. The mind affects the emotions, that the emotions realize that instead of desiring a good steak or some other pleasures of this world, the real thing it aspires to is more sublime interests, including the aspiration for transcendence and spirituality. So those very emotions have now become elevated into what we call midas sichlim, if you remember. We spoke about how the midas become actually midas sichlim to the point that they're not even focused on their own feelings. In other words, there's no hergish. They're just so absorbed. So when you're standing in awe of something, the emotions are part of that experience. The love and awe to something far greater than your own self-interest. The emotions began with self-interest and subjectivity, then it grew to appreciating godliness that's beyond the emotions, and those emotions get elevated there. So that was explained earlier at length, how the emotions become part of Bina and even Chochma. And but now he's going back to another point, how they are actually elevating Chochma. That's how the Chochma and Bina elevate the emotions. But now he's saying that these emotions, as they get encompassed in Seichel, they actually elevate Seichel to yet another higher level to get back to what he calls the higher level of getting to, well, actually Bina getting back to its atzmis. So if you want to know about the midas, how midas become part of Meichen, I would go back to pages 1235, 12, even earlier, 1235, 1236. I'd probably start with 1233 through 1236 is where he talks a lot about that.
Yeah. So I'll go back and learn it. What I remember is how they get elevated into let's say, a better version of themselves, but that's different than saying they become sichli themselves. Maybe it's
so go back there. He talks about becoming sichli themselves as well.
Okay, I'll take a look. Thank you.
They don't become seichel. I didn't say they become seichel. They become elevated to that level of reaching something beyond the subjective, as I explained it back then.
Okay, thank you.
Essentially, it's basically a combination of behavioral conditioning where you train the midas to appreciate things that are beyond the subjective, and then there's the fundamental element of revealing the midas as they are the core essence of who you are. But we haven't finished yet, so there's more to go, especially in the end of this paragraph. I think it's going to be I'm stopping here anyway, in the middle of page, or the beginnings of page 1243. But the next section is, again, there's Kabbalistic language as well as Chassidus, so we have to move a little slowly here to get it all.